My dad had been very active in Little Theater. In fact, my dad was written up. I've got a copy of it was in the Little Theater program for one of their shows back in the probably late 40s. My dad passed in 1945 in the Philippines. But while he was still in France, he had sent in a donation to a building fund. Because at that time, the Little Theater had what was the old Howard Johnson's, where Brajota's is now. And apparently they had been discussing a building fund or of some kind, and my dad sent a check to them, which they recognized as the first donation to their building fund. And I meant to bring a copy of that, but I have to locate that. My dad was William Derwood Hartley, and you always knew whether somebody knew him from something like the service or whether it was a hometown. In the service, everybody knew him as Bill, but in Jamestown, he was Derwood to everybody. He went to high school here, but ironically, he did not graduate from Jamestown because that was right in the midst of the Depression, and my grandparents moved out to California. They were only out there for 1 or 2 years, but that's where my dad actually graduated high school, out there. Then came back and I didn't realize that he had apparently, Alfred must have had some kind of program where he got some of his college done here through Alfred, and then went to Denison and completed his degree at Denison. My mother had gone to RIT, which at that time was only a 2-year school. Mm-hmm. She came to Jamestown after she finished school and was head of it was a house for young women where they not only lived, but she would teach them homemaking life skills at that time. It was part of the Roosevelt New Deal programs, and they met. She had been very active in her church in Buffalo, and so she came to the one down here. My dad had been very active in the First Baptist Church here in Jamestown, and that's where they initially met and got together. And, so they were married just, I think, November of '41, just before Pearl Harbor. And they lived here, and I was born here. My dad was older, so he was, at that time in the war, not in the draftable age, and then was married. And once my mother became pregnant, they weren't drafting, at least at that point. But he volunteered and enlisted and went to boot camp in Fort Niagara, leaving in May of '43. So it was just a few months after I was born. I was born in February. And so I've got a few pictures of him, but my first real recollection of him was literally the day they brought his body back from
Did they explain
the
much
Philippines.
what happened to him?
Yes, it was. He spent most of his time in France. He went overseas just before Easter of 1944. He had been in New York, and in fact, I've got a letter from my mother that wrote to him saying that she was going to come down and surprise him for Easter, show him her new Easter bonnet she wrote about. But my grandfather had been, he was the postmaster on the rail car. Mail in those days mostly traveled by rail, and he was on the main line, New York Central run from Buffalo to New York, and would be gone for a week, and then he'd be home for a week. He got down to New York, and he would usually look up my dad. Well, all of a sudden he was gone. They didn't give him a phone call to make.
No.
When they left, they just left. So he went over to England, and I think probably somewhere around Easter time in 1944. Then went to France, received his field commission to second lieutenant, and after Germany surrendered, his outfit was transferred to the Philippines. They went through the canal, and shortly after they cleared the canal, Harry dropped the bomb, and they circled for 2 or 3 days, I guess, and then half the convoy got sent home, and the other half sent on to the Philippines to relieve the many forces that were over there. And he became very ill out in the middle of the jungle. They had a field hospital set up, and I had a chance many years ago to talk to his company sergeant, who also became one of his best friends, and we remained close to them till he passed. And I actually got to see the location where he was in 1976. I was sitting in my office in the Wellman building, and I received a phone call from Dick Kimball's father, who we had done some work for, and answered the phone, and the first thing he says is, "Lynn, how'd you like to go to the Philippines?" And he knew nothing about my background, so it really took me more than by surprise. Turned out he was president of the local Rotary Club, and they were in the process of looking for a team to send to the Philippines as part of what Rotary sponsors, the Rotary Group Study Exchange Program. And you had to be a non-Rotarian, and so I said absolutely, and then I told him the story, and I applied, and I was fortunate enough to be accepted for that program. And in those days, it took me away from the office for 2 months. We went to the Philippines, and I had the good fortune to, because when you're over there, you stay with local members of the Rotary, and the first household I stayed in was a retired Air Force colonel who had been pilot of Air Force One for Harry Truman. And retired colonels still, even though they're retired, carry a lot of juice. I had the information on where my father was buried, but no idea where in the world that was. So he took the information I had, contacted Clark Air Force Base, and the next day I knew at least the city where it had been, and we happened to be scheduled to go there 2 days later. And so we went there, and after the Rotary meeting that we attended, I asked the gentleman that was my host driving me for the day if he would mind helping me find this particular location. And it was a little barrio or village. And the other members of the group normally get taken on tours of local businesses and to show them how they're all the things that they're doing and so on. But of course everybody on the team knew my history and the story, and they all wanted to go too. So there are about 4 or 5 carloads of us and these Filipinos driving around the countryside in northern Luzon looking for the place that had been the cemetery where my father had been buried. Where he had actually died, the hospital was on the grounds that was now a airport for one of the larger cities in the northern part of the Philippines. And so we found, not only did we find where the cemetery had been, the little building that was used as a chapel was still there, still used by the local villagers, and we found it on my birthday.
Wow. Wow.
So that was probably one of the more emotional moments of my life in the travels that I've had.
I'm tearing up over this here. Wow, that's a fantastic story. Did he, since he had malaria? Is that what it said?
He developed pneumonia. He got pneumonia,
Sure.
and then developed kidney stones. And he was literally, as his friend Mike DiMartino, he's another story altogether. His family owned a fish market in New York City. So I have a lot of fish stories out of that. But Mike said that he literally had been so sick they couldn't even transport him from that hospital down to Manila, where they might have been able to treat him and possibly save him, but didn't make it.
That's a hell of a story.